Hey guys, we have Eric and Sean with OzoneTCG and special guest Half Miss with Common Charity. Go ahead and take a look at his Twitter and join the Discord for Common Charity tournaments. We brought Half Miss on today just to talk about the most recent um, Common Charity format Cup. 64 players, 6 Swiss rounds. Half Miss, do you have anything to say?
Uh, it was very interesting. I'll give it that. I didn't expect to hit 64 players. I thought it was going to be like maybe in the 30s. And then we ended up getting, actually, I think we ended up getting 70 players, but then, a few people had plans on Sunday and it kind of just landed on a perfect 64. So,
Awesome, alrighty. I know NBT I saw started following this. This is already picking up traction just because it's a brand new format.
yeah, the actual Discord started as an offshoot of his, and then he shilled it in a video, and now we're at 1,000 members. So
Oh
that's a
wow.
thing.
I was looking just the other day. I think I saw like 300 members. I thought that was already a lot, but that's crazy. Like actually
Yeah, I mean
insane.
it's picking up.
That's good.
It's picking
Awesome.
up. But yeah, and then just recently on this particular Twitter is I have a little bit of say but realistically it's run by a couple of the other members. So they're everybody's kind of picking it up, trying to make the format something interesting.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, we can go ahead and take a look at the tournament data we saw. I think what is the top four is still going to be playing out or had just finished. We're just going to be waiting on the finals for this. We can at least see the conversion rates for top cut as well as what everyone was playing.
Yeah, definitely. So if we look at the top 64, this was or not top 64, but the 64 players. This is the full breakdown of everybody who entered. Couple of interesting notes. First of all, about half the people brought quote unquote good decks.
Mhm.
That being said, obviously the format's very new. A lot of people, as you can see, we're still exploring some interesting strategies that maybe haven't gained as much traction. I know a couple of people, for example, are on like Luna Kaiju, which some people think are good. I know a lot of people are kind of pushing to see if like zombies are good because like the full like Shiranui, Unizombie, Swallow Slash type core is all
Mhm.
intact. But mostly, you see a lot of people on what are considered sort of the two best decks right now, which are Tenyi and Lunalight. Um, the other deck that a lot of people have been clamoring for is Goki. I think a lot of people thought about Goki when they first heard about the format, and it is decent, but it got very little rep. One, because I think people want to experiment with stuff that isn't already kind of solved, because Goki kind of builds itself.
Mhm.
And two, it's not as good as Teddy and Lunalight, at least in my opinion. And I think in a lot of people's opinions who have been playing the format, because it kind of just sits on the towers. But like if you have an out, they have zero interaction, unlike Lunalight and Tenyi, which have like actual disruption they can set up. Tenyi sets up like the counter traps and blackouts. Lunalight sets up like things like the rank 4 Evil Swarm. I think it's Thanatos. Or maybe it's the other one,
Evil Swarm
Nightmare.
Nightmare. Yeah, yeah.
Nightmare, that's it. So the decks kind of actually do things on your opponent's turn. Um, but and then beyond that, you see a couple of other decks that people are kind of really pushing for almost like a quote unquote tier 2 contention. Melfi is really picking up a lot of steam right now, at least in the Discord. And I know a lot of people are kind of really excited about it because um, a lot of the issue right now with commentarity, and this is a common theme across all the decks you'll see that are actually decent, is you need some sort of payoff. You have a lot of enablers in common charity. It's actually kind of incredible
Mhm.
how many enablers and starters are in the format. But what you don't have is a lot of the good generic extra deck payoffs that like you have in advance. So like things like Savage Dragon, Apollo, any sort of like Omni or Disruption or anything like that. Even just like good utility links like Nightmare Phoenix do not exist in this format. What a lot of the good decks that you'll see represented have, though, is some sort of archetypal payoff. Tenyi has all of the normal monsters and the trap cards and stuff like that. Lunalight has all its Lunalight stuff, and it's got one of the few good rank 4s in the format in Nightmare. Melfi has Joyous Melfi, which with Kalantosa is a lot of grind and a lot of disruption. Similarly for Cyber Dragon, you've got a lot of your OTK tools still. Paleo is a weird one. Paleo doesn't actually have like any of their payoffs,
Mhm.
but it does have a lot of room for outside engines because you don't use your normal summon at all.
Right.
So you see a lot of the paleo lists on things like actually like Melfi to actually push for that engine because they're all rank 2 stuff anyway. Or you see a lot of the paleo lists on things like Luna as their normal summon. That's kind of a payoff. And there's a couple of rank 2s that like aren't bad, especially since like you're not really setting up rank 2 turn 1 with paleo most of the time anyway. So a lot of the decent rank 2s actually are okay going second. Like there's the Phantom Knight rank 2 that just negates something and turns it attack to 0. That's actually quite okay going on turn 3. And then you see just at the end here, we've got a little slice of Gren Maju that kind of just popped up. Summon Kaijus, Big Bungus. You don't really need your extra deck. And it's got a lot of its enabler still too. You've got Eater of Millions, Desires, Gizmek, Orochi, which is an absurd card in this format.
Right.
That's most of the top rep. Like I said, a couple of interesting things in the kind of bottom half. You got a couple of people on things like like I said, zombies and stuff like that. A couple of people on like pens. You had the one Goki player that showed up that, as we'll see, the one Goki player that unfortunately did not even talk. So there's that. But a lot of experimentation still going on. I think total, after a couple of changes towards the end, we had about 30 different decks show up in the 64 players that entered. So, I mean, that's a really good spread for, like a new experimental format.
Yeah, it seems almost like, and I hate to compare it to Pokemon, but that's almost like a lot of the decks you see in the Pokemon trading card game, where you have up to 15 or 20 decks that are decent enough to play in a format like that, or what most people have compared to as the Pauper format in Magic.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other interesting thing to note is that a lot of these decks that are in this kind of bottom half, they have like a lot of like potential. Like I said, it's still very early in the format.
Right.
A lot of things going on, a lot of things being experimented with. I think as people are starting to realize the power level of this format is obviously quite a bit lower than the TCG, people are kind of starting to open up a lot more to some maybe what looked like weaker deck ideas, but for the purposes of this are still like perfectly viable for something like a tier 2, tier 3 thing. Like I know I've been testing, and a couple other people have been testing a lot of like Machina and kind of like machine stuff, because Gear Gigant is in the format. So you have just this like really, like you don't end on disruption, but you just have a resource loop that keeps going, and that's good enough for something like this.
Yeah, and especially with Machina Fortress, that card, I always have the opinion that card's just insane. It's always been insane, especially because you have half of the discard you need for it for free. That's what I would probably play, or either that or Tenyi myself if I were to play in this format consistently. But it seems like there are still a lot of unexplored deck ideas. Obviously, and the more players that we have later on, 64, pretty good number considering how new the format is and considering it's not sponsored by any locals so far. But I'm excited to see what larger tournaments bring. If this is going to stay the same, if it's going to still be 15% Tenyi, 10% Lunalight, or if it's going to shift dramatically where we see a lot more representation, or if it goes the other way where we see Tenyi, Lunalight, even Melfi take over more.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, especially once the format becomes any more solid, because this is so early. So many things can change with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, so we have this is what the 64 players played for the Swiss, and then for Top Cut so far we have pretty interesting conversion rates from what we've seen. If we want to go over those now. So we have the 3 Lunalight players, 1 Tenyi, 1 Paleo, 1 Sidra, 1 Pendulum, and 1 Melfi. And we have the conversion rates over on the bottom right as well.
Yeah, so a couple of interesting things. First of all, surprisingly, for a fairly new format, this was very consistent with what people were playing. A lot of the time when you see a new format or something unfamiliar, you'll see a lot of like weird stuff break through. I know this was only 64 players, but even then, you see pretty much all the decks except for Pendulum were what was represented in kind of the top half of the Swiss half.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing of note is that Lunalight has an absurd conversion rate compared to everything else. Yep. The only other thing that matches its conversion rate is Pendulum, but that's really more of just the nature of the fact that Pendulum only had 2 players on it. Mm-hmm. Lunalight had the second most, represented portion of the bracket over in Swiss, and it ended up still converting 50%. Whereas Tenyi, despite having many more players, did not convert nearly as well. In fact, it has the worst conversion rate. Not to necessarily say that it's like a worse deck for it. Realistically, Tenyi is probably still one of the best decks in the format. It's just that there are so many people on it that you wouldn't unless you had almost everybody convert, it would have had a lower conversion rate anyway. And that's kind of just the nature of that. But I think it's interesting that Lunalight seems to be such a strong deck for this, at least around its early stages, and B, just sort of how weirdly on point a lot of the players were in Swiss on trying to figure out decks that would make it to the top cuts.
Yeah, it seems quite interesting that, because we don't even see this as often, I don't think, in the TCG, where it's relatively evenly spread for a brand new format, where we see a lot of changes normally in what would be considered our standard format, the regular TCG format. Decks converting so easily, again, relative to what everyone's playing. I think it's really interesting. Even with the Pendulum sneaking in there, you could probably see one or two more, of those other decks, and it would still be pretty accurate. I think this is quite interesting to see, especially for a brand new format and with more players. I think there, again, since it's only 64 players, it's not the best, the highest amount of people you could probably have, but as time goes on, I think it'll be interesting to see if this will remain true, or again, if it'll shift dramatically, between what's been topping and what's not been topping.
Yeah, and I think another interesting thing of note is, I think possibly what contributed to that is a lot of these decks that are doing well that you see right here are decks that don't need a lot of change from the advanced format, which is possibly what contributed to them doing well anyway. I mean, if you look at like the Lunalight pool and the Tenyi pool and the Paleo pool, I mean, you take out the Paleo XEs, you take out like Draco Masters from Tenyi, and you've basically just got like the same constructed deck. I know a couple of people, of course, have been messing with Paleo normal summon engines and stuff, but I mean, that's more so the frog half of it, not so much the Paleo half of it. Right. Same thing goes for like Melfi, right? Like you take out like Melfi the Force and you've got basically just the constructed Melfi deck. So it's possible that as time goes on and people start to pick up on maybe some of the decks that need more substantial changes, or maybe are more unique to Common Charity in their viability, that then we'll start to see some different kind of top cuts or different types of representation. I know personally, at least, I've been really pushing to try and find chain burn builds that are good, along with a friend, Ren, who because we both think that like chain burn is possibly good, because you have basically other tools there as well. I know a couple of people, like I said, are really messing with zombies, and I bring that up because I honestly think zombies have a lot of potential for this. Just Shiranui, Buna Zombie, plus like either vampires or like maybe even like Skull Servants as an engine just seems like such like a tight package to run. And then you've got just like things like Pendulum that another thing that came up was like Fabled, where you have a few decks that have these really potent possible combos. Fabled in particular is very sort of like a glass cannon thing, but in a format without Nibiru that might be possible to optimize to a point where it's relevant, where you kind of just push for like some of the really powerful payoffs that are still left in the format. In the case of like Pendulum, you've got like your Odd Eyes Fusion Monster, that's an Omni. In the case of like Fabled, for some reason Blazar is a common. So you've got Blazar. So it's really interesting. I think things like that, and you see that in the TCG too, the advanced format, where you've got a lot of decks at the beginning of a format are going to be things like Altergeist and Invoked and stuff like that, where they don't really need solving particularly. They're very sort of build themselves, not too bad to play. They're very sort of like straightforward linear control decks. Whereas like things like Combo that has to deal with like working through disruption at a turn and stuff, that usually takes a bit more time to optimize, and I think that's might also be what's happening here as well.
Do you think there are any cards that were underplayed or overplayed in this tournament?
I think a lot of people are not on Ash Valor in this format right now. Now, I am not 100% sure if that's correct or not. I'm not necessarily saying it's wrong. I'm not saying the player should absolutely be playing that. But a lot of people have not been playing Ash Valor and instead been playing more impactful, like back row, or they've been playing board breakers instead. I'd be interested to see if that trend continues because I mean it's Ash Valor, but it'll be interesting to see if that stays consistent. The other thing I know is that depending on what the top decks are, there's not a lot of good link payoffs right now. So I know a few people in the tournament were on Dimensional Barrier. I think it was 3 players in the top cut were on sided Dimensional Barrier. I wouldn't be surprised to see that go up in play after this because it hits pretty much every deck here except for maybe Tenyi, but I mean like, you know, hitting every matchup but one in the format's probably good enough.
Right.
And then other than that, I think a lot of the, you know, good staples have been kind of like sniffed out at this point. I know on the Common Charity Discord, I've got a list of a lot of the really common ones to play. And the staples that maybe are less common too, I think a lot of it is because they're more like limited to what decks can actually play them. I know, for example, like Denko Seka, absurd card, has a common, but really only Tenyi from like this top cut can play Denko Seka. Lunalight kind of wants their normal for the Lunalight monsters, and everything else kind of plays enough back row that it's not like a viable option, for example. I will say the other thing though, is the one thing that got played pretty much everywhere is kaijus or lava golem. People are really on like the kaiju lava golem train because it gets over all like the towers type protected beaters that are in this format. It gets over things like a Joyous Melfi without giving them the priority to trigger. It gets over the Lunalight fusion that has Dragoon protection. It gets over like the Tenyi links without triggering anything in graveyard. If you ever see the matchup, because apparently nobody's on the deck right now, it gets over Goki towers. Now, whether or not that's like such a mandatory thing in every single deck, I'm not 100% sure. I believe Kaijus had pretty much the largest staple ref across side and main decks in the top cut. I think only one player was not on a Kaiju type monster. So that's possibly something that's seeing a lot of play and maybe is something to capitalize on if you're playing a deck that doesn't really care about Kaijus, things like Paleo that saw a top cut rep here. Other than that, I think it's pretty consistent. You know, you see a lot of the things you would expect anyway. A few people's were on like Solemns. A few people were on, you know, like various forms of back row removal. I think both Cosmic and Twin Twisters are legal for the format. So other than maybe those things like hand traps being very low in play and Kaijus being very high in play, I don't think there's anything like super surprising anywhere.
Okay, gotcha. Nice. I'm curious now, mentioning Solemns, which one was the most popular? I know previously I was thinking that Strike was going to be the most popular Solemn, but I think I saw Warning, you know, start to pop up. Was Warning still more popular, or was like Solemn Strike or Judgment more popular?
I think it was Warning was most popular, and then Judgment and Strike were tied. A lot of people are on Warning right now, specifically because of Lunalight, because the big like Bungus you're kind of scared of, it doesn't die to card effects anyway, and Warning can negate Lunalight fusion as well as the Pendulum monster that they've got the fusion summons. So a lot of people are on Warning right now to kind of help deal with Lunalight a bit more effectively. Strike and Judgment, I've seen similar amounts of play on. Strike, of course, is Strike. It's a bit more flexible going second, whereas a lot of people also like Judgment because it has a similar application to Warning, where it stops a lot of the same stuff. But notably, of course, it costs a lot more life points, and it's maybe not quite as good going second. The other reason I know a lot of people were on like Warning and Judgment over Strike early on, at least, was because people were trying to build for Grand Magi, which people thought would be a lot better than it ended up being. Not that it's a bad deck, just, you know, not like best deck.
Right.
But that's ended up not being as strong. So I think a lot of people now are mostly just doing it for the Lunalight matchup.
Okay, gotcha, awesome. Do you think, as more players go on, do you think we'll see the same representation, or do you think it's going to favor more, maybe 2 or 3 decks in Top Cut, or will we see even more decks?
I think realistically what'll happen, as with any format, is unless there's some, like, of course this is very early on, so keep in mind that, if there's another deck that pops up that's on a similar power level as Tenyi and Lunalight and stuff, then sure, like, that'll show up in Top Cut. But I think realistically, as with most formats, once some of the better decks have been solved, you'll start to see it kind of shift towards those decks. Maybe it'll change in what's the best deck at any given time. I mean, you look at something like GOAT format, and GOAT control is now considered like low tier 1, tier 2 deck. And so I think maybe it'll shift, but I think at the end of the day, this is probably pretty consistent with what we'll see in the format. Is you'll see maybe a few one-off tops, and then a couple decks that got 2 to 3 tops. In the context of a top 8, of course, top 16 will have applicably similar numbers, just for more decks per pie chart piece. And I think realistically, the other thing of note is that at least from what I've seen, I have a very hard time imagining right now Lunalight not remaining somewhere near the top, if not just being the best deck, period. It just does so much. It sets up decent turn 1 boards because of the rank 4 engines and kind of Dragoon's protected beaters. It just does so much damage. It has protection for your big damage pushes. It can extend through a lot of disruption. It feels the closest thing we have to like an advanced deck right now. I think Tenyi is similarly strong, but I think people are maybe a bit more prepared for Tenyi. That being said, unlike Lunalight, which now I don't want to say Lunalight hasn't gone through any sort of innovation. Lunalight players in the Common Charity Discord have been doing a lot of deck building theory with that. But Tenyi has been interesting because similar to Paleo, it doesn't use your normal. So a lot of people have been testing some very interesting hybrids and seeing success with it. I know one player on the Common Charity Discord, for example, is on Tenyi rank 3 Fiend Paleo and has actually been kind of winning a lot of games with it. So that's interesting. So I think realistically the general numbers will stay the same. I think there's going to just be like a consistent 2 or 3 decks that are going to be on top, and you'll see more tops from them. But I think it might shift what decks those are, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, I see. Now we were predicting to an extent. We had some theorizing here that we would see some battle traps. So I kind of equate this almost to 2013, 2014. Where it's more of you have a big beater, right? And you have the ability to toolbox. That's what makes a lot of these decks pretty good, generally speaking, of course. Now, back in 2014, we played battle traps. We played cards like Breakthrough Skill. Obviously, you could play Breakthrough Skill in this format, but most of the Mirror Force cards are in the game, or in the format rather. Have you really seen any of those, or has anyone been theorizing about those?
So I think the thing that's interesting here is the decks that you actually see represented here just are not the types of decks that would play the battle traps. Outside of Paleo, and I will say Paleo is not on any of the battle traps. It is all chainable removal or a couple of just really strong traps like the Solemns and the and Torrentials and stuff. I think battle traps are fine coming from just me personally. I think Storming and Quaking and Drowning all have some decent amount of potential. I know a few people have been on Drowning in particular, just because it ends up working in a few decks particularly. I know people are playing in Yosenju Kaiji, which is a deck that's got a little bit of popularity. But I think the biggest issue with battle traps that ended up cropping up that was not a consideration before in or a lot of initial theory is specifically to do with Lunalight now. Lunalight has, if I can remember the name of the card,
I think it's Kaleido Check when you use it for, or if it's banished.
It's banished. That's it. It was the Kaleido. Yeah, you can't use the battle traps, which is a huge issue when Lunalight is currently being represented as the best deck in the format. So I think if Lunalight ever loses some popularity, I think you then might see a little bit more like Battle Trap representation. You might see a few people on Mirror Forces and stuff. But I think if Lunalight remains the best deck to this degree, I think that just makes it a bit too difficult to reliably resolve them.
Okay, gotcha. Awesome. Yeah, that sounds pretty accurate to what we're seeing so far. I don't know if Sean had any other questions, but I think this is a really good breakdown. And I appreciate you coming onto the channel, of course. This is already incredible work just within the past not even 2 weeks since the format was revealed, and how much data we already have, even just off of one pretty, relatively small tournament compared to what we see normally for the TCG format. Yeah, I mean, again, thank you for coming on. We'd love to have you on even more because we want to explore Common Charity as much. I think, honestly, this has probably the most potential to grow for the alternate formats. Even with Time Wizard, with like GOAT format being probably the most popular, I don't see it having the same player discussion as Common Charity, because this is always going to grow. This format's always going to grow with new set releases, and now Commons actually, or again, Common reprints kind of matter more, rather than just for the market, but also to play exclusively for a format.
Yeah, definitely, and I'm hoping it continues to grow. I didn't expect quite this much passion for the format from a lot of people. I thought it would mostly just be Time Wizard's discussion, because it's like, you official GOAT, official Edison. But I'm really happy to see that so many people enjoy the format, and hopefully things continue to grow, and I get to lose my mind even more over like 128 person tournaments.
It's only going to grow. Honestly, I can see. I don't think it's going to drop off anytime soon. Maybe not so much for other formats, but I think, like I said, Common Charity has such a high ceiling to grow. Well, again, I thank you for coming on, Half Miss. Guys, make sure to join the Common Charity Discord. Make sure to follow Half Miss's Common Charity Twitter. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.